Hello. Hello, everybody. I am Nico Sanguinetti. I'm the curator of collections and exhibits at the Juneau-Douglas City Museum. And I would like to start today's presentation by sharing my screen. I'm going to play my pre-recorded presentation. And then afterwards, I would like to invite everyone to ask questions and have a little bit of discussion about not only this particular project, but about museum exhibit development and planning as a whole. So this presentation is going to be Echoes of War, the Power of Voice in Museum Design.
Right up top.
Hello everyone, I'm Nico Sanguinetti. I am the curator of collections and exhibits at the Juneau-Douglas City Museum. I would like to acknowledge that we are on Tlingit Ani, the ancestral homeland of the Akwon and Takuquan, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Today I will be presenting the power of voice in a museum exhibit by looking at the Juneau-Douglas City Museum exhibit, Echoes of War, Unangax Internment during World War II. Museums haven't always had the best reputation for working with others. Colonial practices are arguably the #1 reason why many museum collections exist in the first place. However, in the last few years, there's been a large push in the international museum community to decolonize museums. While the actual definition of decolonizing is still open for debate, the main goal is to expand the perspective, viewpoints, and authorities beyond the dominant culture group, which is generally white European colonizers. Given how much information was actually lost during the colonization process, one can argue that no one can fully decolonize a museum. However, it's an important step in recognizing past mistakes and paving the way for a better future. And that future is giving voice and authority in exhibits to the people.
So sorry, everybody. It does seem to be
people being represented by those exhibits. When looking at bias in colonial practices, it's important to look inward as well as forward. To that end, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the institution that I represent. The Juneau-Douglas City Museum began its life as the Last Chance Mining Museum in 1976. It has resided in several locations around downtown Juneau before settling into its current location at the Veterans Memorial Building and used to be the old library in 1989. Because our museum began as a mining museum, the collections do reflect this, with the majority of the collections being made up of non-Indigenous material. However, various directors and curators have worked over the last 20 years to help diversify our collections to better represent our diverse population and history of Juneau and Douglas. And the current staff of the City Museum continues to follow their example. To that end, I'd like to talk about Echoes of War, Unangax Internment during World War II. I do have to begin with a cliche. I am always learning. It's the way I approach my role as a curator, historian, museum professional, and just as a general person. That being said, I plan to discuss how we set about planning and implementing this particular exhibit. There's always room for improvement and flexibility, and each exhibit is always going to be unique, and its planning process is going to present different struggles, challenges, and achievements. Our exhibit is about the internment camps at Funter Bay on Admiralty Island during World War II. Japanese forces invaded the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska in June of 1942. Within weeks, all Alaska Native residents of the Aleutian and Pribilovian Islands were forcibly evacuated from their homes and sent to 5 internment camps in southeast Alaska. For those on the Pribilovian Islands of St. Paul and St. George, that meant the unannounced arrival of the United States Army transport ship Delaroff. They were given several hours to pack one suitcase or one bag apiece before they were loaded onto the ship and set sail. They didn't know where they were going or for how long. Even the military personnel on board didn't know their specific destination until they were already at sea. They were transported to Funter Bay on the west side of Admiralty Island, about 30 miles from Juneau. Those from St. Paul were housed at a defunct cannery, and those from St. George were housed at a defunct mine site on the opposite side of the bay. Food was scarce, water sources were unsanitary, and conditions were generally poor. As a result, disease ran rampant, and about 10% of the population died, which was in fact higher than the nearby German prisoner of war camp at Excursion Inlet. Because the Pribilovian Unangan were evacuated in June of 1942, they were not able to complete the annual seal harvest. Therefore, the federal government lost about $1 million in expected revenue. Therefore, in the summer of 1943, the men from both camps were ordered to return back to the islands, technically still an active war zone, to complete the annual seal harvest. They were told if they did not do so, they would never be allowed to return back to the islands, even at the end of the war. When they did go, they were paid. However, they were paid about a third to a fourth of what they would be able to make in Juneau at the time, which was in turn about a third to a fourth of what a white person was making at the time. At the end of the summer, they then were returned back to Funter Bay and continued to live there through the winter until the next year. The Pribilovian Unangan were finally allowed to return home in 1944. However, upon their return, all they found were destroyed and looted homes and churches. Although there were no active military engagements on either St. Paul or St. George, their homes had been used to house military personnel, and the same military personnel had used their homes for target practice and taken anything of value or of use out of their homes. As a result, those of St. Paul and St. George would spend years rebuilding not only their homes but their lives. From an exhibition planning standpoint, let's start at the beginning. Why this topic? The subject was actually brought to us by an outside community group. They had been working here in Juneau for about 5 years before we became involved. They had been working towards raising awareness about the internment camps as well as working towards a path of healing. Due to the close proximity of Funter Bay to Juneau and the lack of general knowledge and awareness of the internment camps, the City Museum felt that it was an important topic around which we could build an exhibit. However, from the very first moment, we knew that it was going to be a sex-sensitive subject that would require the utmost respect. That shouldn't ever really need to be said. However, it's always an important reminder that often from an institutional standpoint, events in the past are treated with this third-person removed perspective. This doesn't always accurately reflect the feelings or emotions of the people who were involved in these stories or their descendants. Handling the trauma that comes with internment camps was never going to be easy. So I began to research. One of the reasons why we chose to work on bringing this exhibit to life is that it's not about a very well-known event. The academic material reflects that, in that there's not a large amount of material out there for study. Luckily, I am located here in Juneau along with the Alaska State Library and the Alaska State Archives that do have an amazing amount of material that they were very helpful in letting me go through. Also, the community in Alaska of archives, museums, and libraries is very close and very supportive, and there were so many people that were very helpful in trying to find any material I could possibly find about this subject. As I was in the process of reading everything I could find, I began to reach out to as many groups as possible that might feel some ownership over this history. That meant tribal governments, Alaska Native corporations, fishing associations, regional associations, local government, heritage organizations, museum professionals that worked in museums in the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands, federal and state organizations, and private citizens whose families had been affected by the internment camps. Part of this process was just being honest and asking others who else I might think to include and to invite. I'm not Alaska Native, and I do not live near the Pribilof Islands. I was not familiar with which groups might exist or who might be interested in being involved. Some of this was pure online research and then cold calling or cold emailing until someone was kind enough to get back to me. And I was very lucky early on that I was able to connect with two lovely ladies who worked for the tribal government of St. Paul, Seraphima Edlin and Lauren Devine. And they were crucial to help pointing me in the right path on who else I should invite and make sure that I was connecting with the appropriate people. So this created a larger working group with multiple objectives. First of all is the museum exhibit. Second of all is working towards protecting the cemetery at Funter Bay through a legislative bill that would add the land of the cemetery to an already existing Alaska State Marine Park. Unfortunately, that bill did get stalled in the Senate during this last legislative session due to COVID. However, it has been pre-filed in the House, and we're hoping with the support it has now that it'll move quickly next year. Third is the creation of interpretive panels to be placed on site at Funter Bay. We've heard time and time again from people who have been out to Funter Bay, even many, many times, and have never heard of the history of the internment camps there. It was very important for this group that these panels be placed to help acknowledge and explain the history of the internment camps at Funter Bay. I acted as the secretary and more or less communication person for this group, which allows me to remain in constant contact with our group members across the state. And members of this group have a range of specialized knowledge that really help guide this larger project forward. And members of the larger group were kept informed of our exhibition progress, but I had a separate advisory committee that I relied upon for specific exhibit development questions. And I'll come back to that committee in just a minute. Once we had a larger working group established, we needed a focus and a path. And what I mean by that is that this originally Juneau-based group had developed objectives and had done before I came on board. These goals had never been officially presented to the groups or governments that represented the Pribilovian Unangan who had been interned. Through the two tribal governments of St. Paul and St. George, these projects were officially approved. However, specifically with regards to the exhibit and the on-site panels, there was a lot of questions about who would be writing this material. It was very important for me that anything that was written was specifically approved by those on island. Many people living on St. Paul and St. George today are family members of those who were evacuated and interned at Funter Bay. That trauma is still felt by those living there, and it was very important that anything that was written was approved by these family members. To get a better idea of what themes and topics family members might like discussed in the exhibit, the tribal government of St. Paul was kind enough to host an elders workshop, where elders and community members were encouraged to come together to discuss the evacuation and internment and identify what topics they felt might need to be highlighted in the exhibit. I put together some themes and topics that I thought might be good drivers for the exhibit based on my research, and they were gracious enough to weigh in on those as well as add some of their own. It was also an amazing experience just to listen to people talk about the evacuation and internment and their family members' memories of the event. And I was lucky enough to be able to call into the meeting and listen to the discussion. The themes that were identified by the elders at this workshop would become the base for my entire exhibit design. The group also nominated 3 elders to act as an advisory committee to this group and to speak for the elders at large throughout the exhibit development process. This elected group of elders was also able to come down to Juneau to meet with the working group, as well as the various subcommittees that have been working on these 3 objectives. For the museum exhibit, this was an opportunity to show them the space that I was working with and walk them through exactly what I was thinking for the exhibit. It was also another great opportunity to build connections between these elders and me and establish trust and reflect that what I was trying to put together for the exhibit was based on what they themselves had talked about in their workshops and in the various meetings since then. I was able to see if I was on the right track, and they were able to ensure that everything that was being planned was along the lines of what they wanted. I mentioned before that we had put together this larger working group. It was made up of over 30 people, which can be a bit unwieldy for receiving responses on exhibition planning. So as a result, we created an advisory committee specific to the museum that was made up of less than 10 people that really became my go-to group. Seraphima, who lives on St. Paul, acted as my go-between and my connection to the elders, and some of them actually were even able to connect with us via teleconference and kept in contact via email. This is where honesty and acceptance really was the key to our exhibit success. As I mentioned before, I have no connection to the Pribilovian Islands or Unanga culture, and many people in my advisory committee have never worked on a museum exhibition before. So there would be many times where I'd have to come to certain members of our group and go, cone of honesty here, and explain my situation. Luckily, by the time that we were discussing the more specific elements or ideas about the exhibit and the text for the exhibit, all of us had been in pretty constant contact for over a year and had gotten to know each other very well. So this made for very honest dialogue that was crucial to the development of this exhibit. When it came time to develop our actual exhibit design, I drew on what had been said at the original Elders Workshop, as well as everything that they had said since then. I also looked at the taped recordings from the hearings that were held in the 1980s when the Aleut people were fighting with Japanese Americans for reparations from the World War II internment camps. And everything that I heard really revolved around the feeling of the event, how it felt to be forcibly removed from their homes, how claustrophobic and terrifying they found the forests of Southeast Alaska to be, how hungry they were, how happy they were to return home, and how hurt, even now, that such an event could have ever happened. I knew we had to do something beyond a traditional museum display of objects and cases with words. We had to try and capture some of those emotions. Also, due to the nature of the event, with them only being allowed to bring one bag and being housed in dilapidated and destroyed buildings and then returning home to destroyed and looted houses, not a lot of material culture survives. So even if we wanted to do a more traditional didactic museum display, we didn't have the things that you would normally put into that case to write about. That being said, we also needed to make sure that we were providing enough background and supplemental information that visitors to the museum who had never heard of Funter Bay, or possibly even the Pribilovians, could follow along with the story. So we came up with the following strategy. The building that houses our museum was originally built to be a library. As a result, we are a bit limited with our space and how we can use that space to flow and exhibit. We decided to dedicate 3 galleries to this particular exhibit and story. 2 out of the 3 following a more traditional exhibit layout, mostly using informational panels and then large-scale images projected onto walls using projectors. The first of the galleries would act as an introduction with information about the Pribilof Islands as well as the military situation that would lead to the evacuation and internment. The last gallery would give additional information about the internment camps throughout Southeast Alaska. There were a total of 5 internment camps plus Wrangell Institute for Many Children, where Aleut residents of the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands were interned during World War II. The main gallery is dedicated to the event itself, focusing on the internment of the residents of St. Paul and St. George at Funter Bay. We wanted it to be as immersive as possible, as well as be told through the words of the people who were actually interned. Therefore, the entire narrative of the exhibit is told through quotations gathered from different documentaries and from the reparation hearings as told by survivors of the internment camps. They are accompanied by large-scale photo murals meant to give visitors a better idea of the various places that are being discussed in those quotations. We built a ship's railing where visitors can stand and get a last look at St. Paul, just like Unanga who were taken from St. Paul on the Delaroff. We also built a replica of a portion of a cabin very similar to what the Pribilovian Unangan would be living in at Funter Bay, where they would be living in very close quarters, often with only a blanket on a clothesline to act as any shield of privacy. We also have a sound system which plays sounds that the residents of the Pribilofs would hear on a daily basis. The sounds of waves, wind, birds, and seals, a soundscape that would be very different than what they would be experiencing at Funter Bay. Every piece of writing in this exhibit went through multiple rounds of editing and review by our advisory committee and our group of elders. In the end, we opted for less words and attempt more at conveying the journeying along with those from St. Paul and St. George. And important to the elders was that this exhibit finished with positivity in the present day, that we reflect that this event did not destroy the Pribilovian Unangan, and although they still feel the effects of the internment camps, they are not defined by it. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the different challenges that we faced using this group-based model to plan our exhibit. Timelines. Not everyone works at the same speed or on the same schedule. Museum timelines are notoriously strict. We plan exhibits years in advance, and there's often so many moving parts that it is essential that we stick to a pre-approved timeline. This led to a lot of give and take with our particular group. Transparency and honesty were the words that I really tried to live by. That meant keeping everyone involved up to date with my hard deadlines, what I was working with, sometimes needing to augment them for specific group members to make sure that the pieces that I was looking for were turned in on time, and sometimes needing to work around something if I wasn't able to get it in the timeline I needed. A good example of this is that I was hoping to get a large amount of family photographs from people on island related to those who had been interned at Funter Bay. Unfortunately, even though we put out a call 6 to 8 months ahead of my hard due date for going to print, it wasn't able to get any. However, since the exhibit has opened, I've been sent a number of amazing photographs that are a huge boon to the exhibit. And instead of just excluding them, they are now part of our slideshow that plays in our introduction gallery. Working with people across the state. This is an amazing benefit, but it also causes a lot of complications, especially with our particular group. We've got a number of group members that live in some remote locations where internet and phone service can be pretty spotty. And with a large number of our working group teleconferencing in, any kind of lack of service could easily mean missed meetings. This usually resulted in a number of follow-up phone calls as well as small group Zoom meetings. However, as the secretary and de facto communications person for our group, I was the one that got to organize all of those meetings, so additional scheduling, somewhat annoying. However, it did mean that I got to speak one-on-one with a large number of our group members and got to know them at a much deeper, more personal level. And this led to much better communication and much more honest conversations, which I think led to a much stronger exhibit. Working with people who are not museum professionals. Now, I know that I am probably speaking to a majority of people who do not consider themselves museum professionals, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, for a lot of us in the field, we've gotten very comfortable with a particular routine, a particular timeline, a particular style of writing, researching, which results in a particular voice showing up in our exhibits. It can be very difficult and uncomfortable to relinquish some of that control. This is really where transparency, honesty, and trust come through. I had to learn, appreciate, and accept what story they wanted to tell and how they wanted it told. They had to learn, appreciate, and accept that there are certain institutional, physical, and monetary constraints that we had to work within on my end. But this led to a lot of interesting discussions and creative problem solving that ended up making the exhibit a lot better. The best example of this clash comes in the form of the inclusion of information. A gallery only has so much wall space. On top of that, a general visitor only has so many words that they will read in any given exhibit. With a story like this from Funter Bay, we were faced with the stark challenge of trying to fit everything into a small space. This meant a lot of back and forth with our advisory group about what we would include and how we would include it. Again, a lot of that very creative problem solving and what was the root of what they wanted passed on to the visitors and how we can say that in the shortest amount of words. Often, instead of having a large description, perhaps a particular quote or a particular photograph would better illustrate what we were trying to say instead of making the visitors read it on a large informational panel. And again, I do think this led to a much stronger exhibit because we were able to present a more rounded story in a way that's more digestible to people because they don't have to read nearly as much. Acceptance. When you relinquish some of that control and you are trying to fit a narrative that's not of your creation into a preset structure like an exhibit planning schedule, you have to accept that it's going to take time and you're often not going to get it right. You have to be willing to go back to the drawing board and to try to truly listen to what the others want. However, when you're able to harness that voice, the exhibit is so much stronger and so much more personal than anything you could have created from a third person removed academic perspective. And it makes for a very personal process in which you really have to accept each other's strengths and weaknesses, knowledge, ignorance, and bias. And it is a difficult process when it's something that you're not used to doing on a regular basis. However, practice makes perfect. And I will admit to have had my moments of frustration, moments of happiness. I've definitely cried during this process. I'm sure many museum professionals will admit to that at some point in the planning process. However, in general, this exhibit is so much stronger because of the voice that we were able to put into it. And that was really the voice of the people from St. Paul and St. George. And they really have ownership and authority over the story that's being told. And as the curator, accepting and relinquishing that control is often a struggle, but acting mainly as the vessel and the space to share this story has been so rewarding, and I really do think that it is one of the strongest exhibits we've managed to create together. In closing, I would like to thank the dedicated group of people that I have worked with over the past almost 2 years now to bring this exhibit to life. And the exhibit Echoes of War, Unangax Internment during World War II will be on display at the Juneau-Douglas City Museum until October of 2021. Unfortunately, we are closed at the moment due to COVID restrictions. However, we are scheduling for private viewings of small groups. So if you would like to come and see this exhibit in person, please give us a call. And we will hopefully be open soon to the public again. So thank you very much for your time. And again, I'm Nico Sanguinetti, the curator of collections and exhibits at the Juneau-Douglas City Museum.
Hey, thank you everybody for your patience with my slow download speed. And so now that we're finishing up that pre-film presentation, I'd like to open it up to any questions. Sorry, I was trying to view the chat while presenting, but it wasn't coming through.
Hi, Nico. This is Beth, and I'm just wondering what other future plans there may be in the works for the exhibit or other projects that might come out of this.
Thank you, Beth. So the exhibit is still growing and developing. So we are going to be having a new touch screen coming into the museum here in the next few weeks, which will help expand on the story of the internment camps at Funter Bay, as well as give more background information about Unanga culture and life on the Pribilovian Islands. We are also working on developing more programs around this exhibit and this story that we're hoping to put into effect in the next couple of months. We did have a wonderful panel discussion a few weeks ago with various members of our larger working group who all grew up or still live on St. Paul. That's actually available on our YouTube page if anyone's interested in watching that. In terms of future plans and using this model, I think as the museum shifts its focus to include a more diverse reflection of our community, which is diverse as a rule, we're going to be looking at you're using this kind of group-based model for future exhibits that might explore more difficult subjects that can be traumatic to those who might be involved. We want to make sure that any stories that we tell here at the museum are also being told with the voice of people who are involved or connected to those stories as well. We want to make sure that even though we come from, like I said, that kind of third person removed academic standpoint, we want to make sure that we are giving voice to the people who are related to these stories, and to make sure that we are working in partnership, not necessarily as an outside viewer, which I think traditionally museums often thought was the appropriate way to act. And I think as we move more towards decolonizing, and whatever definition wants to be projected through that word, I see it more and more as partnerships and conversations and working more with our community than necessarily presenting an outside story done not in conjunction with the people who are represented in that story. So I have a question from Jennifer, as she says, thank you very much for your nice words, but asking how long the planning process was. And the process for us was about 1.5 years, which is a bit shorter than often we want in the museum world. Museum exhibits are generally planned 2 to 3 years in advance to make sure that we give enough time for that give and take, like I mentioned, because there always are going to be those unexpected roadblocks that pop up, and we want to make sure that we're not here at the last minute wanting to present something and then coming up with a very reasonable reason to stop, but because we're held to those institutional timelines, not being able to do it. So for us, it was a bit of a shorter timeline than we would normally do, but a lot of that had to do with the fact that both our director and I came on board just slightly before we were approached by this outside group. I had literally been the curator for about a week before they reached out to us, and we had, because of this transition, a little bit more flexibility with the schedule in the next couple of years. And our first opening was summer of 2020. And we thought that should be enough time, let's try. So for us, it was about 1.5 years. All of 2019, half of 2020, we opened the first weekend of June, originally planned to open the first weekend of May, but COVID-19 pushed things a little bit. So about 1.5 years for us. Jennifer also asked, what was the most unexpected thing that you learned in this process? I think the most unexpected was the kindness, I think, from the people that we were working with. I think there's a little bit of a fear sometimes from an institutional perspective when you are trying to tell a story like this with so many conversations happening, not only on a local scale, but on a global scale about whose voice is being presented, how is that story being told. And when you're conscious of that and you want to make sure that you are doing things in quote unquote the right way, there's a lot of room for error. And like I mentioned, we're definitely not aware often of the biases that we hold, regardless of how much we don't want to have them. So I think that I went into this project initially thinking it would be very similar to a traditional exhibit, learned very quickly that wasn't going to be the case, thought that's great, and then realized that I don't know a lot about this culture that I was trying to write about, and I didn't know these people, and they lived so far away from me, so it was very difficult. I couldn't just take them to coffee or try and get to know them because they live so far away. And to be met with the kindness and the acceptance of this group of people who could very easily have been very upset with me for trying to tell a story that's not mine or trying to be perceived as pushing my agenda on them, and just the acceptance and commitment to working as a team and as a partnership, I think was surprising to me. I think I expected more difficulties when in fact, all of the elders that I work with have been nothing but supportive and helpful, even when they're presenting something that I had never considered or was going completely against what I had thought or presented. Everything was done with the idea that we're moving towards this or moving through this together to create something together. And that made it feel like a very supportive environment and made me want to obviously continue and to work even harder to make sure that I was able to give them what they wanted and to express the ideas and the emotions that they wanted expressed. I think that for me was, it may sound cliche, but that was the acceptance and kindness was probably the most unexpected. Just looking to see if anyone else has any other questions for me while we're here.
Hi, Nico. It's Crawford. Can you give us a sort of general feel of the feedback from the people from St. Paul and St. George about the exhibition, and whether that journey you were trying to portray really sort of came across in the way that they wanted it to?
Sure. Thank you for your question. From every feedback we've gotten so far, both for those who have come into the museum and those from afar, has been really positive. Unfortunately, we had planned for the elders group from St. Paul, as well as a larger group, to come down for this summer, especially for the opening, as well as to place the panels out at Funter Bay. But unfortunately, COVID-19 kind of put a halt on that. They weren't able to leave for their safety. So most of them have not been able to visit the museum to see the exhibit in person. However, we've tried as much as we can to send as much of the exhibit to them as we can through videos, through photographs, through programming. So from what they've seen and what they've read, they've given us very positive feedback, stating that it's reflected what they had thought of, and in a way that maybe wasn't what they saw in their mind's eye, but they really enjoyed how it turned out. And from those who have come into the museum itself, we haven't obviously had a lot of tourists come through, but the majority of people that have come in and seen the exhibit have told us that either they had never heard about this subject and they were very grateful, though sad, to have learned about it, or people had heard mention of something like this nearby, but had no idea how close it was to Juneau and how impactful it was to a larger group of people. It was one of those kind of distant historical events that didn't really touch on their consciousness till they came into the museum. So overall, we've been very happy with the feedback. We have brought a few people to tears, which is not normally something that you are happy with, but it has seemed to really move people while they've been here, which was really what we were aiming for, especially when we realized that we weren't going to be able to do a traditional display, which as a curator, automatically you have that moment of, okay, what are we going to do instead? And as a small museum, we are quite limited with funds and with space. And so we were really trying to get as creative as we possibly could. And I do have to say we're very grateful to the State Museum, the Alaska State Museum, for granting us a grant and aid that allowed us to do more of the immersive work that we wouldn't have been able to do without their help. So we are very grateful for that. And I know we're winding down a little bit. I know the next presenter is going to be on here in less than 10 minutes. So before I go, I would just very much like to thank everyone for tuning in to this particular presentation. I think museum behind the scenes is something that is often glorified or idealized in films and in books. And so much of it is just a lot of hard work by a lot of dedicated people. And I know that I'm the one person presenting at this particular session, but I must note that this was the work of a lot of people, not only those on our advisory committee, but the staff here at the City Museum. They were very helpful with just about everything I needed when I needed it, not only for academic research or for institutional help, but also on a personal level, and for the support. It was very, very necessary and helpful. And to the group at large, this this exhibit is so much a result of a community, not only here in Juneau, but across the state. It's a real accomplishment of a large group of people coming together for a single goal, people with very different backgrounds, very different specialities, different knowledge, different biases. And I do think it is a huge accomplishment that this group of people was able to come together and really work towards something as interesting and as different as this was. So a lot of appreciation to all of them as well. I know not all of them are here on this session, but it was a great group effort and a wonderful learning opportunity. And for anyone who has any interest in anything museum related, I am always available via email. My email is on our city museum website. And I'm also happy to answer questions after the fact if something comes to you later on. We also host internships for students, and that's something we're working on developing a little bit more as we move forward with this process as well. So hopefully there will be more opportunities for students if they're interested in doing something related to the museum field or in history, academics, even things like building, exhibit design. We always joke with a couple of people that I work with that most people don't realize that there is a speciality of building exhibit displays. And so you don't necessarily need to be a history fanatic to intern with us. If you're interested in anything related to community engagement, to our public history, just about anything can tie into the City Museum, because we do really work to be a representation for Juneau and Douglas. So if that's something anyone is interested in, feel free to reach out to us.